Rain hammered the metal roof of Millbrook Community Center at 3 in the morning, and Officer Caleb Whitcomb had his hand wrapped so tight around Ranger's leash that his knuckles were white. The sable German shepherd would not move. He sat facing the old upright piano on the community stage, ears pricked, chest rising slow and steady, eyes locked on the yellowed keys as if a voice were speaking from inside the wood. Caleb whispered his name. Nothing. He pulled. Nothing. Before we go any further, tell me down in the comments what part of the world you're listening from, and hit that subscribe button so you don't miss stories like this one. Caleb had walked the graveyard shift at Millbrook for almost 7 years, and in all that time, the dog beside him had never broken a single line of protocol. Ranger did his sweep the same way every night. He checked the east corridor first, then the gym doors, then the little library, then the community stage, and finally the janitor's hallway. He did it in the same order for so many years that Caleb sometimes joked the dog would still walk that route if the building disappeared around him. But tonight, on the stage, Ranger had simply stopped. He had walked past the security desk without looking at Caleb, straight down the center aisle between the folding chairs, up the 3 wooden steps to the stage, and he had sat down in front of the piano like a soldier reporting to a post. Caleb crouched next to him. He put a palm on the thick fur behind Ranger's ear. The dog did not turn his head. He did not whine, did not sniff, did not blink for what felt like a long time. He simply stared at the keys as though listening to something no one else could hear. Caleb was 34 years old, a wide-shouldered man from a small town in northern Ohio where his father had worked at the paper mill, and his mother had cleaned rooms at the roadside motel out by the interstate. He had joined the force at 22, and he had asked for the K-9 unit the day he was eligible. He liked animals more than most people, and he had never once been ashamed to say so. When they had assigned Ranger to him, the dog was already older, already a working veteran, and the department told him the assignment might only last a few years. That had been 6.5 years ago. In that time, they had cleared out drunk teenagers from behind the ball field, found a lost dementia patient in the woods at the edge of town, and once talked a young father down from the bridge that arched over the Cuyahoga on a bitter February night. They had done it together, and neither had needed to say much. Now Ranger sat on the stage as if the rest of the world had gone quiet. Caleb pulled again. Ranger's head turned slowly, but only halfway. Only enough to give his partner a look that Caleb had never seen from him before. It was not defiance, it was not confusion. It was something patient and stubborn, as though the dog was saying, in the only way an animal can, that he had a reason and that he needed Caleb to wait. Caleb waited. He waited for 8 minutes on the empty stage while rain rattled the roof and the fluorescent lights hummed in the ceiling. Then Ranger rose on his own, walked down the steps, and finished the sweep, as if nothing had happened. The next night, at exactly 3 in the morning, the dog did it again. The third night, Caleb brought his phone. He set it on the piano lid and hit record, and stood back beside the folding chairs with his arms crossed and his heart beating in a way he did not like. Ranger sat and stared, and Caleb watched the recording bar move across the screen, and the whole time he was telling himself there would be nothing on it. A dog was a dog. Old dogs did strange things. He would show his supervisor the video, they would laugh, they would send him back on his rounds. He drove home at 7 in the morning, with the sky the color of concrete, and he played the recording twice in the truck cab before he pulled into his driveway. He sat there so long that his coffee went cold in the cup holder. What he had caught on the microphone was faint but unmistakable. Between the hum of the fluorescent lights and the tap of the rain, 3 soft, uneven piano notes had sounded from inside a locked, empty building. 2 lower, 1 higher. A hesitation between the second and third, as if the hand playing them were young and unsure. Caleb was not a man who scared easy. He had pulled a body from a car wreck the year he turned 26, and he had held a child who did not survive a house fire the year he turned 29, and neither one had stopped him from doing his shift the next night. But sitting in his truck with those 3 notes playing again and again in his ear, he felt a cold move up his spine that had nothing to do with the November rain. He slept badly. He dreamt of hallways he could not find the end of. When he woke at noon, he made himself a plate of eggs he did not eat and drove down to the community center and asked to see Maggie Ostrander. Maggie had run Millbrook Community Center for more than 20 years. She had watched 3 generations of kids grow up on that stage, learn to play recorder, take their first ballet steps in her mirror-lined room, hold their high school graduation parties in the gym. She was a level-headed woman with a grey braid down her back and reading glasses always pushed up on her head, and she had a laugh like a screen door slamming. Caleb had known her since he was 12. He respected her the way a person respects a stone wall. He played her the recording in her office with the door shut. Maggie sat very still. She did not laugh. She did not lift the reading glasses down from her hair. When the notes finished, she pressed the pause button herself and set the phone gently on her desk as if it might break. Then she looked past Caleb at the wall and said, in a voice he had never heard her use, "Please sit down for a minute." He sat. She got up and closed the blinds, and then she opened the bottom drawer of her desk and took out a photograph in a small wooden frame. She set it on the desk between them. It was a boy, maybe 10 years old, at the same piano on the same stage. He was sitting up straight with his hands hovering over the keys, biting his lower lip in the way children do when they are trying very hard. Beside the piano bench, curled on the wooden floor, with his big black nose resting on the boy's foot, was a puppy that was unmistakably a young sable German shepherd. Maggie asked Caleb how much he knew about the first handler who had trained Ranger, back before the dog was assigned to the department. Caleb knew almost nothing, only the name in the file, Marcus Rasmussen. The paperwork had said he had left the department years ago for personal reasons and had moved out of Millbrook. Maggie said Marcus was Eli's father. She said Eli was the boy in the picture. She said Eli used to come here after school with a house key of his own and practice on that piano until his mother, Denise, came to pick him up in the little blue station wagon she still drove today. She said Eli had been 11 years old when a truck lost its brakes at the top of the hill on Route 12 on a rainy Tuesday in October, and the little blue station wagon had been sitting at the intersection at the bottom. Denise had lived. Eli had not. Ranger had been a puppy in training, only a few months old, spending afternoons with the boy while Marcus was on shift, learning to sit still and be gentle and answer to a name. Maggie said Marcus had never come back to the community center after the funeral. He had left the department 6 months later, moved to Kentucky, and the puppy had been reassigned into the General K-9 program. She said the piano had not been tuned since the week Eli died, because no one on the staff had the heart to do it. Caleb sat with his hands flat on his knees. He wanted very much to tell Maggie that he did not believe in the kinds of things her face was suggesting. He wanted to say that a dog was a dog and a piano was a piece of wood, and that there had to be a rational explanation. Instead, he asked quietly whether anyone had known that Ranger used to belong to Eli. Maggie said Marcus had asked her years ago to keep it out of the file. He had said the dog would have a better life if no one ever told him where he came from. Caleb drove home in silence. He did not turn on the radio. He did not stop at the diner where he usually got his egg sandwich. He kept his hands at 10 and 2 on the wheel like a young driver, and he tried to build in his head the kind of rational explanation he had promised himself he would find. A loose string, a mouse inside the piano, a draft that moved the pedals just so, the old furnace pipes running under the stage. Any one of those things would do. The next day, he brought in Wesley Grover, the piano tuner who had worked on the school district's instruments for 30 years. Wesley was a soft, patient man with hands like a farmer's. He opened the upright, took out his little felt wedges and his tuning fork, and worked on the instrument for the better part of an afternoon. When he was done, he sat back on the bench and told Caleb the piano was in worse shape than any instrument he had touched in a decade. 3 of the felts were rotted. 2 of the strings had corroded through and been sitting slack for years. One of the hammers was cracked. There was no possible way, Wesley said, that this piano was producing a single audible note on its own. He said it as a professional. He said it as a man who had spent his life listening. Caleb thanked him and paid him out of his own pocket and did not tell him why he had asked. That night, at 3 in the morning, Ranger sat in front of the piano and Caleb recorded again, and the 3 notes played, thin and clear, from a piano that could not play them. He brought in a contractor the next morning, Ben Callahan, who had done the roof work on Caleb's own house the previous spring, a burly man with sawdust always in his beard. Ben crawled under the stage with a flashlight. He tapped the walls. He checked the ductwork. He climbed up into the ceiling and shone the light down through the rafters. He came back an hour later with cobwebs on his shoulder and told Caleb there were no pipes running under that stage, no ducts anywhere near the piano, and no draft strong enough to move a candle flame, let alone a piano hammer. Caleb thanked him too. He brought in an electrician, Grace Turner, a small, sharp-eyed woman who ran a shop over on Willow Street. Grace tested the outlets and the wiring in the wall behind the piano. She checked for interference, for feedback, for stray voltage. There was nothing. The wiring behind the stage was newer than most of the building. Nothing hummed, nothing sparked, nothing that could have made a musical note vibrate a copper string. She left him with a bill for $80 and a puzzled look he did not want to interpret. Meanwhile, Ranger was falling apart. Caleb saw it first in the food bowl. Ranger had always been a careful eater, never greedy, but he had never left a bowl half full. Now he sniffed his dinner and turned away. Caleb tried chicken. He tried the good brand of kibble that cost $12 more a bag. He tried scrambled eggs, which Ranger had loved since he was 3 years old. Nothing. The dog would take a mouthful, chew slowly, and lay his head down on the kitchen floor. Then Caleb saw it in the sleep. Ranger had always slept flat on his side, feet twitching in dog dreams, sighing every so often. Now he slept in short bursts, 20 minutes at a time, and he woke up staring at the door. When 2 in the morning came, he would rise and pad to the truck without being called. He waited to be lifted into the passenger seat because his back legs had started to shake. He was 2 hours early for his own shift, and he could not be talked out of it. Caleb took him to Dr. Priya Kaminsky's clinic on a Thursday afternoon. Dr. Kaminsky was a thin, small-boned woman with hair she kept in a knot at the back of her head, and a way of speaking that made her seem younger than she was. She had cared for Ranger since he came to the department. She lifted the dog onto her steel table, ran the stethoscope along his ribs, listened for a long time, and then set the earpieces around her neck and looked at Caleb over the rims of her glasses. She said his heart was skipping, not badly, not yet, but she said an animal his age could not carry this kind of stress. She said if he kept losing weight at this rate, if he kept sleeping in 20-minute stretches and going without food, his heart would give inside a week. Maybe 2 if they were lucky, she said. And here she looked at him without blinking that whatever was happening on that shift needed to stop happening. Caleb drove home with Ranger's head on his thigh, and the dog's fur felt looser than it should have. When he stopped at the red light at the corner of Elm and 3rd, he realized he had tears on his face and did not remember when he had started. The next morning, he was called into his lieutenant's office. Lieutenant Diane Halsey was a woman of 58 with iron-gray hair cut short and a way of tapping her pen against her desk when she was about to give bad news. Caleb knew the sound before he sat down. She said the department had received a report from Dr. Kaminsky. She said the department was concerned about liability if a service dog collapsed on duty. She said Ranger had given 10 fine years and it was time to let him retire. She said she had already spoken to a family in the next county who ran a quiet farm with a good porch and a warm kitchen, and they would love a shepherd of Ranger's temperament. She said Caleb would be reassigned to a younger dog by the end of the month. Caleb sat very still. He said he understood. He asked whether Ranger could stay with him for the last 2 shifts on the schedule so they could say goodbye properly. Lieutenant Halsey looked at him for a long time and said yes. He drove home and sat on his porch with the dog beside him and watched the leaves come down out of the maple in his front yard. He did not talk. He did not need to. Ranger put his head across Caleb's boot and closed his eyes for the first time in what felt like days. That evening, the phone rang. It was Maggie. She said the town council had met the night before and the community center had been placed on a list. She was trying to say it as calmly as she could, but Caleb could hear the tightness in her voice. She said the building was old, the boiler was failing, the roof leaked in 3 places, and the town had received an offer from a developer who wanted to buy the land and put in a small strip of shops. She said the council had given her 90 days to prove the center still had a purpose the town wanted to pay for, and if she could not, the building would be sold and the demolition would begin in the spring. Caleb sat with the phone against his ear and looked at Ranger asleep on the porch and did not know why he felt the news like a blow. He had grown up in that building. He had learned to swim in the pool that they had filled in 12 years ago. He had played basketball in that gym on Saturday mornings for most of his boyhood. He had watched his cousin get married in that hall. He had never thought about the building not existing. Now it had a deadline, and the deadline felt personal, as if the developer were also coming for the piano and the sound inside it that no one could explain. He told Maggie he was sorry. He told her he would help however he could. He did not tell her he had been ordered to retire the dog. The next shift was the last one Ranger and Caleb would work together. Caleb dressed in the dark. He took the leash off the hook. Ranger got up slowly and stood at the door with his tail low and his ears forward. He did not eat the dinner Caleb offered. He did not drink from the bowl. He walked to the truck under his own power and waited to be lifted. At the community center, they did the sweep from East Corridor to gym doors to library to stage. At 3 in the morning, Ranger sat down in front of the piano. This time, Caleb sat beside him. He sat on the piano bench, and his uniform creaked, and the folding chairs looked back at him like an empty audience, and the rain outside had finally stopped so that the building was quieter than he had ever heard it. He put his hand on Ranger's head. The fur was too thin. He could feel the shape of the skull too clearly beneath it. He said out loud, "I don't know what you hear, buddy. I don't know what you want. I've done everything I know how to do." Ranger did not turn to him. He kept his eyes on the keys. Caleb had not touched a piano since a woman named Andrea had made him take lessons with her at the church basement 2 years earlier, back when he had thought he might marry her. She had left him, and the lessons had stopped. He had learned 3 chords and a bad rendition of a hymn, and nothing else. But he knew where the keys sat, and he had listened to the recording so many times he could have picked the notes out in his sleep. On a hunch he could not name, he opened the lid. The keys were yellowed like old teeth. He pressed the first note softly. It sounded thin, out of tune despite Wesley's work, but recognizable. He pressed the second, then the third, higher. He held his fingers a moment longer than he needed to. The notes hung in the air of the empty hall. Ranger let out a long, low breath he had been carrying for what looked like weeks. He lowered his big head against Caleb's knee, closed his eyes, and for the first time in almost a month, he slept without twitching. Caleb sat there for a long time. He did not want to move. He did not want to breathe wrong. When he finally lifted the leash, Ranger rose slowly and walked with him back to the truck like the old partner Caleb remembered. At home that morning, Ranger ate half a bowl of food. He drank a full bowl of water. He slept on the rug in front of the wood stove for 6 hours without waking. Caleb sat in his chair and watched him breathe and tried to understand what he had just seen. The next morning, he drove to Denise Rasmussen's house. She lived 2 blocks from the community center in a small yellow bungalow with white shutters and a screened porch. There was a wooden bird feeder in the front yard, shaped like a little schoolhouse, and a wreath of dried leaves on the door. Caleb had not seen her in 12 years. He had gone to Eli's funeral as a young cadet in a borrowed suit, and he had shaken her hand in the receiving line and mumbled the things a person mumbles when there are no right words. He had not seen her since. She opened the door in a grey sweater with her arms wrapped around herself, and he could see in her face that she recognized him but could not place him. He told her his name. He told her he worked at the community center. He asked if he could come inside for a moment. She led him to the kitchen and put a kettle on the stove without asking him. She was 62 years old, with hair that had gone completely white and hands that looked like she still worked in a garden. There was a photograph of a boy on the refrigerator, held up by a magnet shaped like a slice of pie, and Caleb knew the face from Maggie's frame. He looked away and made himself look back. He said he was sorry to bother her. He said he needed to play her something, and he needed her to be honest with him about what she heard. She sat down across from him at the little round table and folded her hands in her lap. She said she was listening. He played the recording. The 3 notes filled the little kitchen, 2 lower, 1 higher. The pause between the second and the third, like a young hand deciding. Denise's face changed slowly. Her mouth did not move, but her eyes filled and one hand came up to cover them. She sat that way for a long time. When she lowered her hand, she was crying without making a sound. She asked him where he had gotten it. He told her. She got up from the table and walked into the little living room and came back with a spiral notebook that was so worn its cover was rounded off at the corners. She opened it in front of him and turned to a page in the middle. There, in the careful, slanted handwriting of an 11-year-old, was a short piece of music written out on lines a boy had drawn himself with a ruler. At the top he had written in the same careful hand, "For my dog, Ranger." Denise said those were the 3 notes her son had been practicing the week he died. He had been writing a little piece for the puppy his father was training, a piece he had told her would be the puppy's very own song when it was finished. He had gotten as far as the first phrase, 2 low, 1 high, and then a pause, because he had not yet decided what note came next. He had died on a Tuesday, and the notebook had sat in the piano bench at the community center for a week after the funeral, before she had gone to fetch it, and she had never opened the page again. She had never told a soul. She had not even told her husband before he left. Caleb put his hands flat on the table because they were shaking. He understood then what he had been trying and failing to understand for weeks. Ranger had not been guarding a ghost. Ranger had been keeping a promise. Night after night, at the same hour in the same place, an old dog with a failing heart had been sitting in front of a piano waiting for a boy who had never gotten to finish his song. He had done it because that was the deal, made a long time ago in the puphood he barely remembered, and because dogs do not know how to stop keeping their word. Denise reached across the table and took Caleb's hand. She said thank you. She said it 3 times, and each time it sounded like she meant a different thing. He walked out of her house into the pale Ohio sunlight and sat in his truck for 10 minutes before he could drive. He did not know how the notes on the recording had come to exist. He did not know if it was a resonance he could not measure, or a memory the building held in its wood, or something older and larger than he could put a name to. He thought a little of all 3. He thought that maybe the world had corners a K9 handler and a night watchman were not required to fully map. He thought that maybe it was enough to know what to do with what was in front of him. That evening he called Lieutenant Halsey and asked if he could adopt Ranger himself. He said the retirement was fine, but he wanted the dog to come home with him. He said he would take responsibility for the medical care, the food, the grave when the time came. He said, please. Diane Halsey was quiet for a long moment on the other end of the line, and then she said the paperwork would be on his desk in the morning. 2 days later, Ranger came home for good. Caleb had bought a small keyboard from a music store in the next town over because he did not want to keep bringing the dog to the community center at 3 in the morning, and because he had a feeling the sound the dog was listening for could travel. He set the keyboard on a low bench next to the wood stove. He turned it to its softest setting. That first night at home, at 3 in the morning, Ranger stirred in his sleep on the rug and lifted his head as if a door had opened somewhere no one else could see. Caleb was already sitting on the bench. He pressed the 3 notes. The dog sighed. He laid his head back down. He slept. Now, if the story had ended there, it would have been a small, private thing between a man and his dog, and no one else in Millbrook would ever have known. But there was still the matter of the community center, and the matter of the 90 days, and the matter of a piano nobody had tuned in 12 years. 2 weeks after Ranger came home, Maggie called Caleb again. Her voice was tight in a different way this time. She said she had been going through the old records in the storage room, trying to build a case for the council, and she had found a stack of ledgers from the previous director. She said something had come up that Caleb needed to see. She would not say more on the phone. He drove down that afternoon. Ranger came with him. The dog walked into the community center at Caleb's side, moved past the security desk, and, for the first time in over a month, did not go to the stage. He went to Maggie's office door and lay down in front of it. Maggie shut the door behind them. She spread 3 ledgers across her desk. She opened one to a page she had marked with a yellow sticky note. She said the developer who was buying the land had a company name that had rung a small bell in her head. She had traced it back through 2 other holdings and found the same signature on the paperwork. The developer was a man named Bradley Coleman. Bradley Coleman was a member of the town council. The town council was voting on whether to sell the community center to a private buyer, and one of the council members was the private buyer, and no one had told anyone. Caleb sat down slowly. He said that was not legal. Maggie said it was not obviously legal, but it was not obviously illegal either, because Coleman had used a different last name on the corporate paperwork, a family name from his mother's side. He had not disclosed his interest. He had voted in the discussion sessions. He had, according to the minutes Maggie had gone back and read, spoken repeatedly and with feeling about how the community center was a drain on the town's budget and how the land could be put to better use. Maggie said if she could prove the connection publicly, the sale would collapse, but she needed something concrete, something the council could not wave away. Caleb sat with the ledgers open in front of him and thought about the 3 notes and the dog and the boy and the woman in the yellow bungalow who had never told anyone. He said he would help. He did not know yet what that meant. He went home that night and Ranger stirred at 3 in the morning and he played the notes and the dog slept and Caleb lay awake looking at the ceiling. The next morning, he called an old friend from the academy, a woman named Rosa Delaney, who had gone into records and was now a paralegal at a firm 3 counties over. He asked her, without giving her too many details, how a person might find out what other properties in Millbrook a man named Bradley Coleman controlled through corporate shells. Rosa laughed. She said that was not the first time she had heard that name. She said she would call him back. She called him back 2 days later. She said she had done some digging on her own time. She said Bradley Coleman was involved, through at least 3 shell companies, in the purchase and demolition of 2 other community buildings in Ohio in the last 6 years. She said one of them had been a small library in a town called Weston, and the other had been a public pool in a town called Riverdale. She said the pattern was the same each time. Coleman had joined the town's council, championed the case that the building was a drain, arranged the sale to his own shell, and put up small commercial buildings that rented at premium rates. She said Millbrook was next. Caleb thanked her. He hung up the phone. He looked at Ranger on the rug. The dog looked back at him with clear eyes for the first time in weeks. Caleb drove to Maggie's office and told her what he had learned. She sat in silence for a long time. Then she asked him whether he thought the town council would care, given that the mayor was Coleman's cousin and half the council played golf with him on Saturdays. Caleb said maybe the council would not care, but the town might. He said he had an idea. He said it was going to sound strange. He said they should hold a concert at the community center, on the stage, on the piano, before the council voted, invite the whole town, play the story of the building, not a speech, a concert. Let the piano do the talking. Maggie looked at him for a long time, and then she said quietly, and who was going to play it? Caleb said, Denise Rasmussen had been a piano teacher before her son died. He had asked around. She had not touched an instrument since, but he thought, and here he swallowed, that she might play again if the story of her son were part of the reason. Maggie said that was asking a lot of a grieving mother. Caleb said he knew. He said he would ask her himself. He went that evening to the little yellow bungalow. Denise opened the door in the same grey sweater. She let him in without a word, as if she had been waiting to see him again. He sat at her kitchen table and he told her the whole story. The developer, the shell companies, the pattern in Weston and Riverdale, the 90 days, the plan for a concert. He told her he did not want her to do anything that hurt her. He told her she could say no and he would not think less of her for a second. Denise did not answer right away. She stood up and walked into the living room and stood by the window looking out at the bird feeder shaped like a little schoolhouse. She stood there for so long that Caleb thought she had said no without saying it. Then she turned and asked him a question he had not expected. She asked if her husband might come. Caleb said he did not know. He said he had not spoken with Marcus in years, and he had never spoken with him properly, only as a name in a file. He said he would try. Denise said if Marcus came, she would play. If Marcus did not come, she would still play, but she wanted Caleb to try to find him. Caleb said he would. That was the first time he saw her smile. It was a small, careful smile, the kind a person tries out to see if it still works. It worked. Finding Marcus Rasmussen took 10 days. He was living in a small town in eastern Kentucky, working the counter at a hardware store, in a rented room above a barber shop. Caleb called him from his porch on a cold evening with Ranger at his feet. He told Marcus who he was. He told Marcus that Ranger was still alive. He told Marcus that he was calling about Eli. There was a long silence on the line. When Marcus spoke, his voice was low and rough, the voice of a man who did not talk much anymore. He said he had wondered whether the dog had made it this long. He said he was glad to hear the name. He said he had not been back to Millbrook since the week after he had left the department 12 years ago. Caleb told him about the piano, about the recording, about Denise, about the concert, about the council. He said, more than once, that Marcus was not obligated to come and that he was not calling to demand anything. Marcus did not answer for a long time. Then he said he would think about it. Then he asked if he could talk to the dog. Caleb said yes and held the phone down toward Ranger's ear. Marcus said the dog's name in the low, calm voice a trainer uses, and Ranger's ears went straight up. The dog stared at the phone as though the world had suddenly made sense. He did not move a muscle for the full time Marcus spoke, which was maybe 40 seconds. When Marcus said goodbye and Caleb lifted the phone back to his ear, Ranger sighed, put his head down on Caleb's boot, and went to sleep. Marcus said, on the line, that he would come. The concert was scheduled for a Saturday night, 3 weeks before the council vote. Maggie put up posters. Caleb told everyone at the department. Word moved through Millbrook, the way word moves in a small town, from the diner to the barber shop, to the church basement, to the school pickup line. People who had not thought about the community center in years remembered they had learned to dance in that mirror-lined room, or been to their cousin's baby shower in that hall, or shot free throws in that gym before the pool was filled in. By the middle of the second week, Maggie was calling around asking for extra folding chairs. Bradley Coleman heard about it too. He called Maggie personally 3 days before the concert. He was polite. He asked whether the event was going to be political. He suggested that any effort to influence the vote would be inappropriate. Maggie told him, in the calm voice of a woman who had run a community center for 2 decades, that it was a concert. There would be piano music. He was welcome to attend. Coleman did not attend, but 372 other people did. They filled every folding chair, they lined the walls, they sat on the wooden steps at the sides of the stage. Ranger sat in the front row on the aisle beside Caleb in his old service harness, with his big head high and his eyes clear. Marcus Rasmussen came in the side door 10 minutes before the start, in a wool coat that was too heavy for the room and a haircut he had gotten that morning at the barber shop above his apartment. He stood at the back until Denise saw him. She walked down the aisle and she took his hand, and neither of them said anything, and the whole hall pretended not to be watching. Maggie opened the concert. She thanked everyone for coming. She talked for exactly 2 minutes about what the community center had been and could still be. She did not say the developer's name. She did not mention the ledger. She said that the piano on the stage had been silent for 12 years, and that tonight it would be played again by a woman who had a story to tell. Then she stepped aside. Denise walked up onto the stage. She looked out at the room. She sat down at the bench. She put her hands over the keys and held them there, and Caleb could see from where he sat that they were trembling. Then she played. She played her son's 3 notes, the ones written in the spiral notebook, and then, softly, uncertainly at first, she played what she thought her son might have written next if he had lived. She let the melody grow. She played for perhaps 10 minutes. She played simple things, folk things, a slow version of a lullaby everyone in Millbrook seemed to remember, and then a piece she must have carried in her fingers for decades because it came out of her without hesitation. She played until she cried, and then she played through the crying, and by the end the hall was so quiet that Caleb could hear the folding chairs creaking as people leaned forward. When she finished, she rested her hands in her lap and looked at the audience. She said softly that she had not played in 12 years. She said the piano had been out of tune, and so had she. She said the community center had held space for her son's music for all that time, and she thought the town might want to think about what that was worth. Then she stood up, and the hall gave her the longest, quietest applause Caleb had ever heard. No one clapped fast, no one whooped. They just clapped, all of them, for a long time. At the back of the room, Marcus Rasmussen was crying too, silently, standing with both hands in his pockets and his shoulders shaking. The story of the concert was in the Millbrook Chronicle by Monday morning. A reporter named Julian Whitaker, who had been in the audience, wrote a long piece under the headline, "The Piano That Remembered." He did not know the whole story of the developer or the ledgers, but he wrote about the concert with the kind of quiet, careful care that turns local stories into things people share. The piece was picked up by a paper in Cleveland, then by a station in Columbus. By Wednesday, someone at a national program had called Maggie and asked her whether she would be willing to talk on air. She said yes, if they would let her mention the community center. They let her. By the time the council met to vote on the sale, the mood in Millbrook had shifted. People who had not been to a council meeting in years showed up. They filled the room and spilled out into the corridor. When the item came to the floor, a citizen named Harold Fields, a retired mechanic who had never spoken at a council meeting before, stood up and read aloud from a printout the corporate paperwork Rosa Delaney had pulled that connected Bradley Coleman to the shell company that had made the offer. Coleman did not attend that meeting either. The vote to sell failed 6-1. The one yes vote was Coleman's proxy, an aging council member named Ronald Peck, who had never voted no on anything in his life and did not seem to fully understand what he was voting for. 2 weeks later, the state opened an inquiry into Coleman's holdings and his votes on the previous sales in Weston and Riverdale. 3 months later, he resigned from the council. 6 months later, he was indicted. And a year after that, he pled guilty to conflict of interest and a fraud charge Caleb did not fully understand. He served 14 months in a low-security facility outside Cincinnati. When he came out, he sold the shell companies. The pool in Riverdale was rebuilt from the settlement. The library in Weston was already gone. The community center stayed. Maggie retired at the end of the following year. She handed the keys over to a young woman named Tessa Ortiz, who had grown up in Millbrook and had come home after teaching music in Detroit for 6 years. Tessa's first project was a children's music program, 3 afternoons a week, free to any kid in town whose family could not afford lessons. The old upright piano was pulled from the stage and finally tuned properly by Wesley Grover, who came back and worked on it for 3 straight days, replacing every rotted felt and every corroded string with a patient care that was almost tender. He would not take $1 for the work. He said he had been waiting 12 years to do it right. The piano was moved into the music program room. Above the keyboard, screwed into the polished wood, a small brass plate was mounted. Denise Rasmussen and Caleb Whitcomb had picked the words together over coffee at her kitchen table. The plate said, simply, "For Ely," and "The Friend Who Waited." Marcus Rasmussen did not move back to Millbrook, but he came up from Kentucky twice a year for Eli's birthday and for the anniversary of the accident, and he stayed a night in Denise's spare room, and they had begun slowly to be in each other's lives again. Not as they had been, something else, something more careful. Denise said she did not know yet what it was, and she did not need to know yet. She said it was enough that he came. Ranger lived for 2 more years. He had good days and bad days. There were mornings when he could barely lift himself from his bed by the wood stove, and Caleb would carry him out into the yard to do his business and carry him back in. There were afternoons when the old dog would trot after the neighbor's kids like a puppy, and Caleb would laugh and pretend not to be a man who cried in front of dogs. Every night at 3 in the morning, if Ranger stirred, Caleb was awake and at the little keyboard on the low bench, and the 3 notes hung in the dark of the small house near the river, and the dog would sigh and settle and sleep. At the end, Ranger did not linger. On a warm morning in late spring, Caleb woke to find the dog already on his feet, standing at the front door with his tail low. Caleb opened the door. Ranger walked out onto the porch and sat down and looked at the yard, at the maple tree with its new leaves, at the sun on the grass, at the wooden fence Caleb had built the summer before. He turned his big head and looked at Caleb and gave one soft, slow wag, and then he lay down on the boards of the porch in the sunlight and closed his eyes and did not open them again. Dr. Kaminsky came out that afternoon and confirmed what Caleb already knew. She said his heart had simply given, at last, of the old wound of loving too well. She said it was not a bad way to go for a dog like him. Caleb buried Ranger under the maple tree in the front yard. He set a flat stone at the head of the grave. He did not write anything on the stone. He did not need to. That evening he sat at the little keyboard on the low bench, and at 3 in the morning by habit he pressed the 3 notes into the empty room. They hung in the dark. There was no dog to sigh in response. Caleb sat with his hands in his lap and let the sound fade. He did not stop playing them. He plays them still every night at 3 in the morning, more often than not before he lies down to sleep. He plays them for a boy he never met, and for a dog who kept a promise longer than any of them had a right to expect. The community center is a busy place these days. On any given afternoon, you can walk in and hear a child pounding out a scale on the piano with the brass plate, or a group of teenagers laughing in the mirror-lined room, or a knitting club arguing gently in the hall. Tessa keeps a photograph pinned to her office wall of a night many years ago when a woman in a grey sweater played a piano nobody had touched in 12 years, and a sable German shepherd sat in the front row like a soldier at a post. Sometimes visitors ask her about the photograph. She tells them the story, or as much of the story as she knows. The full story is between a man and his dog and a boy who ran out of nights. If this story moved you, do me a small favor before you go. Leave a comment about a friend, animal or human who once waited for you longer than anyone else would have. Give this video a like so more people can hear it, and subscribe to the channel so we can keep telling stories like this together. And tonight, if you happen to wake at 3 in the morning, listen for a moment before you fall back asleep. You never know who is still keeping a promise, somewhere out there in the quiet.